Hey fearsome friends, and a happy new year to you all. I've got some rather graphic stories for you today. Not all of them, mind you, but you'll know what I mean. Included are by a couple of writers I have used many times. I've written in the description below which ones are true for you, but see if you can figure it out first. So get cozy, comfy and warm, and enjoy 8 scary subscriber stories. Keep being creepy. I'm on vacation taking a well-earned break from my boring office job, though my boss wasn't happy about me taking 2 months away. I'm travelling all across the US, and I plan on staying a day or 2 in each state. So, I was driving through the Arizona desert and was beginning to get tired. I was hoping to get to the city within the hour, but at around 45 minutes before reaching my destination, or any civilization for that matter, I saw an old, depressed-looking hotel sat on the side of the road. I parked up on the road and made my way over to this extremely intriguing building. Walking in, the place was really old-fashioned. It looked like it hadn't been remodeled since the 1930s. I anxiously walked over to the front desk, and a man who appeared to come from nowhere jumped up from behind the desk. He was old and had a hat on, like a concierge, and was wearing a dark green uniform. He also had a very white, curled-tip mustache and basically looked all-round creepy. "Hi," he said. He spoke loudly with an eerie smile on his face, but there was no emotion in his eyes. "Good evening," I said. "I'd just like to book a room for tonight." "Luxury or regular?" he asked with the same smile and lifeless eyes. I paused for a thought and decided to treat myself. I asked for a luxury room and slugged my way up to it, all the while I could feel him staring at me. On the way up there I met a maid. I gave her a friendly greeting, but she just grunted at me as I passed. I eventually found my room and immediately locked the door. The first thing I noticed was once again the extremely old-fashioned decor. I went to the bathroom, used the toilet and brushed my teeth, then proceeded to read my book and get into bed. After about 5 minutes of lying there, trying to sleep, the old man from the front desk banged on my door and yelled, "Room service!" It was around 1 AM when he did this, so obviously I told him to come back tomorrow. By 1:26 AM he was back again, angrily banging on the door and seemingly getting more and more angry as he yelled again, "Room service!" He's getting so angry and I'm absolutely terrified. If it was an emergency, wouldn't he just get a key? I'll update you in the morning if the banging stops, and I'm probably going to barricade the door. I'll see you guys in the morning. So I managed to sleep a little, but woke up to him still knocking. I got up and looked through the peephole. He was there, looking tired and seeming to be in some sort of trance. My stomach sank, and I felt like vomiting. After the night I'd had, I needed to find out what was wrong with this hotel. I quickly opened the door so I could yell at the man to go away, but he was gone. It was impossible. It had only been 2 seconds since I'd looked through the peephole to see him. I stopped dead for around 30 seconds, trying to understand what the hell was going on. Before leaving, I decided to look around for a while, to try and solve the mystery of this front desk guy. I started to look around, and as I went along it felt like it was getting more and more archaic. The red rugs, the oil lamps hanging from the walls, yet the hallways were still dark. It was so strange, as there were hardly any windows. I found a staircase and tentatively decided to go down them. I became confused for a moment. The bottom floor was near identical to the top floor, so I started walking around the maze-like hallways. I looked into one of the rooms, hoping I wouldn't find a monster or something like that in there. I'd become angry, feeling like I'd been scammed out of an extra $70 for a luxury room. This room was exactly the same as the one I'd slept in. I came across another staircase on this floor. but it was dark at the bottom. I told myself to grow a pair, flicked on my flashlight, and nervously made my way down. By the time I got to the bottom, my knees were trembling and I was downright terrified. I could see what I thought was a static-filled screen, and staring at it I realized that it was hundreds of cockroaches crawling around the wall. Nearby there was a wooden door, so I turned the handle. Immediately I heard the loudest, most blood-curdling screams come from behind it, along with the scratching sounds directly on the other side. The screams sounded like whoever it was being tortured. I could do nothing but sprint to my car and get the hell out of there. Their screams only made me imagine that someone was being held down in there and was terrified of their captor coming into them. I don't know. The whole thing was terrifying. I've been driving for about 10 minutes now and have slowed down. Then I noticed a very old car following me. Looking in my rearview mirror, I am stunned to see that all too familiar mustache and creepy smile with lifeless eyes. There was no door. Despite looking, he could see no door in or out of this room. Maybe the brightness of the white walls, floor and ceiling ruined any chances of seeing an outline of a door. It was so clinical. He sat at a white table upon a white chair. He was dressed entirely in black. The linear grains that he ran his finger along revealed that they were made of wood, so he could break it apart if he had to. There was an odd smell in this white box he found himself in. It was almost like a hospital smell, medical and clean. An ever so slight twang of cleaning products. The walls clicked like bugs scuttling in the night. This stopped for a woman to enter the room. The wall drew on a line, a door, and then opened to reveal complete darkness outside. She walked on through and it shut and erased itself. Was she now stuck in here too? Apparently not. She was wearing a very old-style nurse's uniform. She had dark hair, no expression on a very pale face. She was sort of humming without tune. She also started pacing around the man as soon as she entered the room. Then all of a sudden, she burst out crying, loudly for about 2 seconds, before stopping completely and going straight back to that cold, expressionless face that he'd seen when she'd walked in. The humming began again, as did the pacing. She stopped to the left of the man, removed a sharpened pencil and signaled to him, this time with a big, comforting kind of smile, to open his mouth. Unbeknownst even to him, the concerned man opened his mouth, and she slid the pencil into it, all the way into the back, until he felt the eraser end poke him in the throat. He was confused, a little alarmed, but thankful it was not the sharpened end. She held it there whilst looking over her glasses at the upside-down watch on her breast. She howled into tears again for around 2 seconds, which again was stopped dead in its tracks and returned to an expressionless face. She removed the pencil and put it back in her pocket. Around him she again moved at a slightly quicker pace. This time she removed her pocket from a fountain pen and removed the lid. At this point he felt like a black pawn being looked down upon by the White Queen before she removed him from the game. Same process as before. She slid the pen down his tongue and into the void of his throat, again with sharp ends sticking out of his mouth. The man had no idea why he complied with such odd demands. It was like he had no choice but to do so. She stopped humming to again look at her watch. Again she wailed, throwing her arms up as if her whole life was crashing down around her. But then she was cold again, her tears drying almost instantly on her cheek, leaving track marks of a not-so-distant pain. The pacing started again, and once more was a little quicker, more urgent. She this time pulled out a knife. The man, unable to move his body, and apparently unable to object in any way, trapped under the weight of his fear, opened his mouth to receive the next dose of treatment. She slowed right down, and now the once comforting smile appeared to have more of a stare attached to it. The more she stared at him, the more he poked his tongue out. His mouth was open to its full capability, and his tongue was out as far as it could go. She balanced the sharp part of the blade on his tongue, this time pointed towards his throat. She slowly pushed the knife further in, cutting his tongue along the middle, about half a centimetre deep. Then, with a sharp, painful prick, he felt the tip of the knife ever so slightly pierce the back of his throat. She stopped for a while just to look at him, as if waiting for a response. He thought about screaming, or more to the point, he thought about reacting to the pain he was in, but he just couldn't move. He was paralyzed. She looked at her watch, but this time remained humming. She started to pace around him again, while he sat on the chair at the table with a knife buried into his tongue and fixed in place betwixt his two front teeth. He let out a whimper, and with this she stopped. There was nothing but silence. No humming, no clicking from the walls. He couldn't even hear her breathing. He let out another whimper, thinking that he could maybe appeal to the better nature of this clearly unhinged and emotional ghostly human being. She had stopped directly behind him. He couldn't hear her breathing, but he could feel her cold breath on the back of his neck. He whimpered again, this time almost trying to speak. She hurled herself into another wave of tears, and screaming, threw her arms towards the back of his head, slamming his face into the table, the knife handle hitting first. To him it almost happened in slow motion. He felt the hands grab his head tightly and fully experienced the force from behind him. The handle hitting the table made him jump, despite seeing the table get closer to his face. He could feel the smooth and jolting motion of the back of the knife scraping between his two front teeth. He felt the knife go straight through the back of his neck, like a nail into wood. But most of all, he could hear her 2-second screaming tears stuck on a loop behind him. This was the last thing he heard. I'm a real estate agent. As such, I know this may sound like some beaten-to-death horror movie cliché, but trust me, some properties just shouldn't be on the market. They should be torn down, demolished, their ruins burnt to ash, then the ash entombed in the thick concrete. The following story is about one of those places. My wife passed away 8 months ago at the time of writing this. We have a daughter, Lee, who is 8. Lee sometimes comes on house showings or to the office with me if there is no one available to look after her on weekends and days off. Nobody at work minds. At the start of the month, I was given a listing for the ground floor flat of a 2-story townhouse at the end of a street in Silverdale. That's a rural suburb in New South Wales, Australia. It was deemed unsellable by the firm that passed the listing on to us. I couldn't see why, from the photos at least. It was a little old and worn looking, but it was by no means dilapidated, and it was in a really nice area. You'd think the housing market the way it is, people would jump at the chance. Until I went there myself. Lee pinched her nose the moment I opened the front door. "Yuck!" she shouted, swatting the stench away from her face. Yuck didn't even begin to do the smell justice. It smelled like an entire farmyard had been exhumed, then pissed on, then covered in ammonia. Breathing through the mouth didn't help either. You could taste it. I told Lee to wait till the front step while I gagged my way across the room to the living room window, then to the window in the small kitchen area. The place was bare. It looked clean. There wasn't anywhere for something that could give off a reek like that to hide out of sight. The closets and cupboards were all open and empty too. With the windows open, the air became breathable, and I called out to Lee to come back in. "Is the smell gone, Daddy?" she asked, peering in the front door. "Well," I said, "it's not as bad anyway." Lee stepped in and looked around, like she was looking for the smell. "What was that?" she asked. I chuckled. "Not sure, sweetie. Houses that have been locked up for ages sometimes start to smell." She understood. I was sizing up the place, salvaging it with my eyes more like, when Lee suddenly said, "This house feels sad." "What?" I answered. "I don't know," she said, wrapping her arms around her stomach. "Just sad." This type of comment wasn't unusual since her mother passed. She would occasionally come out with maudlin things like that. It was normal, so said the child psychologist, and I just let them go. The ceiling slowly creaked. It was coming from the long, hardwood beam running across it from one side of the living room to the other. We both looked up. Lee took a few steps towards me. There was a mention in the profile that the second-floor flat might still be occupied. "Oh," I said, "it must be the upstairs neighbor. They probably saw us come in." Lee's eyes were glued to the beam running across the ceiling. She looked tense. "Come on, sweetie, we'd better go up and say hello." I pressed the doorbell and waited, taking a business card out of my breast pocket. Lee stood behind me, softly humming something to herself. It was the first week of summer, and outside the cicadas were raging. Finally the door opened, but only as far as the chain lock would allow it. Inside the flat was dark, even at this time of the afternoon. Its occupant peered out, regarding me with suspicion from beady, bloodshot eyes. "G'day," I said to him. I could see he had a 3-day-old beard, and scabs dried pinkish white were visible through his thinning black hair. He said nothing. "I'm the agent in charge of the property downstairs." Still he said nothing, just stared. "Well, if you hear anybody downstairs, it'll be me. Oh, or my daughter here." I stepped aside so he could see Lee. He eyed her indifferently for a moment, then turned his gaze back to me. "So, I'll leave you to it then," I said. "Thanks." Lee and I slowly headed back downstairs, but it wasn't until we got to the last step at the bottom that the door to the second-floor flat shut. A few days later I went back to the townhouse as I had to put up the for sale sign on the front lawn. I picked Lee up from school on the way. It was late afternoon when we arrived, but it was still stiflingly hot, and the cicadas were in full voice. "I'll just be a few minutes," I told Lee, and left the engine running. The curtains on the second-floor window moved slightly, and I could see the outline of someone standing just behind them, watching. I hammered the stake into the lawn. The soil was hard, and it took a few good whacks of the mallet to get it in securely. Whoever was on the other side of the curtains was still observing me, and it started to make me a little nervous. Maybe they didn't like me taking it upon myself to hammer a sign into their front lawn, unannounced, I thought. My brief interaction with the man in the second-floor flat told me that he wasn't much of a people person. I'd better go tell him, I thought, even though he had already seen me. The last thing we'd need is non-compliance from the other residents getting in the way of selling. Lee was playing with the car stereo. "Sweetie," I said, opening the driver's side door. "How about you come out for a bit? Let's go talk to the man upstairs again." "But he was creepy, Dad." She had a point. "Can't argue with that," I said. "Okay, but you'll have to wait inside then. Do you think you could do that?" She rolled her eyes. Fine. I gave Lee my iPad and put a YouTube video on it for her, then locked the door, instructing her not to open it for anyone except me. I rang the upstairs doorbell. Again the door opened on its lock chain and the same face appeared. "Hey mate," I said. "I've just put the sign up out front." The same stare. "So you'll hopefully be seeing a lot more of me," I jested. Without bothering to wait for a reply, I turned to leave. "There was a girl with you." It was a raspy, deep, loud and cold voice. I spun around. "Sorry?" I asked him. His face still only barely visible through the crack in the door. "Last time you were here, also today, there was a little girl with you." It took me a few moments to grasp what he was saying. "Oh," I replied. "My daughter, yes, she's just waiting downstairs." "What? In that place, by herself?" They sounded more like statements rather than questions. "Yes," I said. "Is something wrong?" He suddenly looked very cautious, as if someone were overhearing us. He leaned very slightly closer to the gap in the door. "She doesn't like people going in there," he whispered, almost as if he were pleading with me. "Who doesn't?" He became visibly agitated. "Look, just go away," he spat, and slammed the door in my face, leaving me stunned. No wonder the place can't sell, I thought, walking down the stairs. Bloody weirdo like that for a neighbour. Lee was still watching the iPad when I opened the door. "Come on, good girl," I said. "How about we go to Sizzler's for tea tonight?" "Yay!" As I turned the living room light off, Lee stopped and turned around to face the empty room, which was now in darkness. "See you," she said. "Oh," I said, digging for the door keys in my trouser pocket. "You were playing with someone?" "Not really, but there was a lady in here before when you weren't here." "Oh, there was there?" Lee didn't answer. She walked out the door past me to the car. I made a mental note to mention it next time we talked to Elaine, who is the child's psychologist. As I was pulling the door shut, I heard a long creak groan from the ceiling in the living room. On the way home after tea, Lee was more talkative than usual, despite the long day. Amidst all the chatter about friends at school and which of her teachers was the fattest, it's Mrs. Russell, by the way, she asked a question which at the time went over my head, but which now has nauseating significance. "Daddy," Lee started, "can people float?" "Float?" I asked. "You mean in water?" "No, like in the air. Not very high, just sort of off the ground." "I've never seen anything like that," I said. Was all she said, and that was the end of that. She doesn't like people going in there. There was no mention of the property, nor of any prospective buyers or renters. It was still for sale and I hadn't given it any thought over the days. Then around 9 p.m. one Tuesday night, I got a phone call from my boss. "Sorry mate, but you're the only one with the keys," he said over the phone. "Take a day off tomorrow then to make up for it. We can manage." The electricity was cut off and needed to be turned on ASAP. Something about the plumbing, although I had no idea how that related to the electricity. I arranged for my sister-in-law to come over until I got back. Lee was already asleep. Even at 9 o'clock at night, the air was thick with high summer heat. The moon, which was bright and full, blazed like a sun in the cloudless night sky. Opening the door to the first floor was like opening an oven. The heat was oppressive, suffocating. I left the front door open to let some of the heat out. There was enough light from outside to light the room enough to find and open the electrical box on the kitchen wall. I flipped the switch, nothing happened. I tried the light switch on the wall and got the same result. A thick film of sweat was already forming on my forehead and neck. I sighed deeply and tried the electricity box again, but nothing. Then the front door slammed shut, causing my heart to squeeze. It was so deathly quiet, the sound was all the more jarring. There wasn't any breeze, much less a wind, which could have closed the door like that. There was a creaking sound coming from the ceiling in the living room. The sound of the door slamming must have disturbed the man upstairs. Great, another interaction with him, that's all I need, I thought. The ceiling let out another creak. It didn't sound like somebody moving about upstairs, though. As I crept further across the floor, I noticed something which caused me to stop dead. There was somebody else in the room. I could make out their silhouette against the window. The form was female, I was sure of that. She looked very tall, taller than me at least. "Hello?" I croaked. I got a hold of the keys in my shorts pocket. It was the only thing I could use as a weapon if this intruder turned aggressive. No answer. Another creak. I gave her a wide berth and edged around her side. From that angle, the light from the living room window mercilessly illuminated her features, a spotlight poised on her for me to see. She wasn't tall at all. She only appeared to be tall because she wasn't standing on the floor. Her bare feet almost, but not quite, touched a small wooden stool beneath her. She seemed to float. A cord of plastic tubing, like a garden hose, ran from a loop tied around it on one side of her neck to the beam running across the ceiling. She was young, maybe still in her teens. Her eyes were open, bulging, but definitely lifeless. Underneath her left eye was a blue-black bruise, and that eye was dark pink. Her bottom lip was split at one side and swollen. A greasy, disheveled mess, which may have once been a beautiful head of black hair, framed her battered face. Through the white one-piece nightgown she was wearing, a heavily pregnant gut protruded, threatening to burst. Then she suddenly jolted, like from an electrical shock, and kicked out the stool under her feet, flipping it on its side. The beam across the ceiling sagged slightly under the dead weight. A gurgling sound started to rise in her throat. This was followed by what sounded like something heavy and wet hitting the floor, like a raw chicken slipping through a soggy paper bag. The insides of her thighs glistened with thick streams of dark red soup. There was what looked like another cord coming from her, a long, raw sausage which ran from her crotch to the thing that just dropped from her onto the floor. There were veins in it. I stumbled back against the wall. My eyes fell to what was lying on the space of floor between her dripping toes. Its tiny legs were bent at the knees and crossed over each other, huddled up as if for warmth. Tiny hands with tiny fingers clutched at nothing. It had black hair over the back of its head, and I could see the back of its head because... No, I'm not going to say why. Between my ears, a heavy thumping that made me lightheaded, and my stomach lurched. There was a squelching sound coming from the tiny body on the floor. Something was turning, twisting. It was now facing me. Two opaque little eyes strained to see through the viscous muck covering its face. But it was definitely looking at me. I tasted bile in my mouth. It burned up from my gut. Its little mouth quivered, then wrenched itself open. Something like raw egg white dolloped from its toothless mouth. Then it screamed. It was directed at me. A scream no human could make. The death scream of something bovine being slaughtered with a sharp instrument. I pushed myself further back into the wall. The girl hanging from the ceiling was still deathly prone, but her eyes weren't dead anymore. They glared at me full of rage and hate, as if I personally had done her some terrible injustice. The shrieking from the floor became more hysterical, more desperate. Police, that's what I have to do, I thought. I'm going to call the police. Leaving the screaming behind, I ran out the front door and up the stairs. The man on the second floor was the absolute nearest human being. I pounded on the door, shouting unintelligibly about wanting help or calling the police, or opening the door or coming quickly. I don't remember clearly. It was all a jumbled mess. The door opened, sending me crashing through it. I collided with something bony that fell to the floor with a grunt. Clutching his shoulder, he said, "I told you not to go in there." In the fluorescent light of the flat, I could see the man clearly. He was dressed in grey cotton track pants and a singlet which was probably once white, but now had a mustardy tinge to it. He was skinny, but his skin looked loose, and he stank like old scrotal sweat, shellfish and male crotch too long unwashed. The flat was full of garbage bags and junk piled up in the corners, some old TVs, a microwave and some vintage exercise equipment. There was a ratty three-seater lounger which appeared to serve as his bed too, sitting in the middle of the room. "Quick," I blurted, scrambling to my feet. "Downstairs, there's—" "Shut up," he said, rubbing his elbow. "You saw her then?" "You know her?" He nodded and got to his feet, wincing. "I used to." He flopped down on the lounger. "Don't know what the hell she is now, but..." He looked apathetic, exhausted more than concerned in any way. I was gradually getting my wind back, but my head still pounded. "What? Who is... how the... what's going on?" I took my phone out. "I'm calling the cops," I said. "Pretty sure the cops know, mate." He leaned forward and fished a large biscuit tin out from under the lounger, put it in his lap and opened it. It looked to be full of photos, the kind printed from old Polaroid cameras. He flipped through a few before holding one at me. "That's me on the left." It was a Christmas photo taken in what looked like a living room in front of a tree. He looked around 18, face riddled with acne and a lot fatter. There was a black-haired girl about the same age standing next to him. She wasn't smiling. "You've already met her." He took the photo away and looked at it fondly. "Last known photograph," he chuckled to himself. I still had no idea what was happening, or what I had seen downstairs. She had to live downstairs after, he smiled to himself lewdly, as he shuffled through the photos. The stupid cow just couldn't keep a secret. "The girl in the photo is the same person I saw downstairs?" I asked. "The same person hanging from the roof downstairs?" "Yep." He seemed off in another world as he stared at the photos. There was a longing, hungry expression on his face. "My sister," he said. There was a... I tried to recall the thing that had dropped out of her. There was something else, too. "Yep," he said. "I'm its daddy." I felt dizzy and wanted to get home to Lee. The decrepit rake sitting on the lounger let out a sigh. In one hand he held a photo close to his face. The other hand was messaging, massaging his groin. His breathing got heavier. It was like I wasn't even there anymore. He violently spat on the photo. His hand kept kneading the bulge under his pants. That's when I left. I didn't lock the first floor door, didn't even shut it. The door keys and the keys to the fuse box were still inside. I got into my car and sped off. All of that happened about 2 weeks ago. I haven't been to work since. I requested some leave, making up some excuse about needing to look after Lee. Not sure if I'll go back either. Though I did do a little digging on the sordid little history of the townhouse. I thought understanding the nature of what happened there would somehow help me to come to terms with what I saw. Ghosts. I saw ghosts. However, I was mistaken. My research just served to put my experiences in a whole new sickening light. Incest, rape, teenage pregnancy, suicide. I won't go into more detail than that. As far as I know, Lee didn't see what I saw, but she did see something. she told me. She drew a picture of it for me, but it's not something I'd stick on the fridge. Thankfully, what she saw wasn't in the same state as what I saw it. The first floor room is still on the market. I gave up the listing when I took my leave. I don't know what's happening to it now. That spindly freak on the second floor can rot with the place as far as I'm concerned. And the two souls on the first floor, they deserve better than to spend eternity like that. Our sex life has suffered, you see. After nearly 20 years of marriage, you just get bored of the same old routine. A spot of half-assed foreplay, then stick it in and wriggle about for a while until finished. Then there's all the cleaning up afterwards. Hardly worth all the effort. That's not to say that I don't love my wife, however. I love her dearly, and as such wanted to spice things up in the bedroom. So, I suggested that we try fisting. It led to a rather frightening experience. After I explained to her exactly what it entailed, and that I wanted to give it, not receive it, she was, as expected, poignantly disgusted. "How is that going to help anything?" she shouted at me, then started sobbing. But after a few hours of convincing, I managed to at least pique her interest, where before there was only disgust. Of course I knew next to nothing about it. I had seen things online and it looked pretty straightforward, but I didn't know the ins and outs of the whole process. What hole would I choose? How much and what type of lube would I need? Would I need gloves, disinfectant, and what position would be best for ease? These questions and many more would have to be answered satisfactorily before I even attempted the act, I felt. So I started online. I joined a forum on a marriage counselling website, the type of place where people can anonymously ask questions and get advice on a whole plethora of topics concerning relationships, sex, child-rearing, etc. And yes, as it turned out, even fisting. After the prudish mods deleted my initial post, I managed to PM one of the users, Stinkfist22, to get more tailored advice. The thing that struck me first was just how much finesse seemed to be involved. Here was naive little me thinking fisting was just a matter of positioning her and letting her have it. This was something that demanded skill, something that Stinkfist said should be perfected. I couldn't wait. The correspondence between me and my new fisting mentor reached the point where we agreed it would be best to meet in person. There are some things, he told me, that need to be shown, no merely taught through letters or on a computer screen. He would show me some techniques using a mannequin he had custom made from a supplier in the Ukraine. Almost, but not quite, like the real thing, he promised. The perfect weight and dimensions to practice on, he said. Stick your fist wherever it will go. Ass, mouth, any hole's a goal, he said on the phone on the afternoon before we met. This is a guaranteed marriage saver. I'm a realtor, by the way, so choosing a venue that would allow us the privacy we needed to study would be of no concern. I had a listing not 10 minutes away, a 3-room flat on the bottom floor of a townhouse. We could spend as long as we wanted in there, barring any sudden open house appointments, and my wife would be none the wiser. If anyone did spot us and tell her, I could just say he was a prospective buyer. Perfect. The hair looks so real, I exclaimed. My friend grunted in agreement as he unzipped the bag fully and rolled the doll out onto the lounge room floor. The man who called himself Stinkfist was younger than I thought, shorter too. His cheeks and chin were dotted with uneven beard stubble. His hair looked like he had cut it himself. You weren't lying, it's so lifelike. The doll was female, of intermediate age, and had long blonde hair, a little matted and frizzy in parts, but extremely lifelike. The face was wrapped in something like cling film, with only the nose exposed. I found this a little odd, but when I asked my friend, The nose comes in handy, he said. I took his word for it. After all, he was the professional. The rest of the body looked as if it were too covered in something. Not the same cling film material like the face, but a thin film of something that felt silicone to the touch, smooth and rubbery. The genital area and backside were not covered in this substance. They really went all out on this doll, didn't they? I marvelled, looking at the pimples on the doll's arse. Put this plastic sheet over there, Stinkfist told me. He must have seen the curiosity on my face. I was quite adamant during our phone conversation that as the property could be subject to a pop inspection, it was paramount that we didn't make any mess. The appearance of the plastic sheet suggested the possibility of a mess. Stuff comes out of its mouth and nose. Vomit or something. I don't know. But it gets nasty. So just in case, we got to lay it on this sheet, he said, preparing to drag the doll over. We, I began, thinking of an alternative, could just put a bag over its head. Tried that before, buddy, he said. Had to resuscitate her. Bitch nearly died on us. I sure as hell ain't going back to jail. Wow, I mused. He really sets the scene for realism. Got it, I said. What you're saying is that we need to think of this doll as being real, being alive. In that way we can properly... I was cut off as he dropped the doll's legs to the floor with a thud. Sure, he said, and winked. You reckon you could help me lift her onto the sheet? I took the doll by the wrists and lifted. Yikes! How on earth did they make it this heavy? I said, struggling under its weight. He winked at me again and smiled. Buddy, could you go over there and get my kit bag? Thanks. As I walked across the room to retrieve his bag, I heard a muffled groan from behind, faint and wheezy, like someone waking up from a long sleep. I could have sworn that just as I turned around to face the sound, I saw something on the plastic sheet twitch. Stinkfist was on his haunches over the doll. He was eyeing me pointedly. You hurry up with that bag, buddy. It sounded more like a threat than a request. I wondered what the hurry was. He took the bag from me, ripped the zipper open, then took a small black pouch out. He looked at the doll again. He seemed to study it expectantly. Should be okay, he assured me. Is anything wrong? I inquired. He put a hand on the black pouch. I'll got this if things get difficult, he said, tapping his hand on the pouch. Something metallic inside clinked. He lifted up one of the doll's arms and turned it over, studying its underside. I could make out several tiny pinprick holes in the surface just below the elbow crease. He nodded to himself, then let the arm flop lifelessly back down to the floor. From his kit bag he pulled out a long, thin, clear bottle. Its label read, Sex Water. Which is your dominant arm, buddy? He asked me. I replied it was my left. A lefty, eh? He grinned to himself, popping the cap off the bottle. Gonna have to lube that up to the forearm. I let the lubricant ooze onto the back of my hand, then lathered it up over the wrist to the forearm with my right hand. No gloves? I asked. In my studies of fisting on adult sites, I came across several videos in which the person doing the fisting was wearing gloves, the long surgical type that reached to the elbow. No, at least not today, he began. You'll be punching the snatch today, maybe the ass too if we've got time. Only need gloves if you're fisting the mouth. Sometimes the teeth can get in the way. And you don't want any nasty cuts on your hand. Unhygienic. It made sense. After my hand was sufficiently lubed, I asked him what was next. Blast, I thought. I should really be taking notes. He spread apart the doll's legs as far as they could go, then he pushed them a little farther apart, until he had to strain himself. Still holding the legs by the ankles, he stood up, arms stretched to both sides. Okay, he said. Now start by joining all your fingers to your thumb, like you're making a beak. I did. It looked so real down there between the legs. Now, what you need to do next is slowly put the fingers in first, then... His instructions were cut off by my phone springing to life on the coffee table next to us. I leaned over and saw Office on the caller ID. However, my hands were slathered in sex water, so I couldn't touch it. Stinkfist saw the situation and let go of the ankles. They hit the floor together with a loud thud. I fancied that I heard a groan from within the cling film around the doll's head. He turned to the doll and waited for a few moments. His eyes moved nervously between it and my phone, and me. Then he picked up my phone, slid the answer button, and held it to my ear. "Got an open house arriving in 10. It was my boss. "You can make it, right?" Stinkfist had his eyes glued to the doll on the floor, but I could tell he was listening intently to the voice on the other end of the line. "I know it's short notice, but we've got to make this one a lock today. We can't keep this listing much longer, mate. We're relying on you." I didn't really have much of a choice. Before I could answer, Stinkfist pressed end and tossed the phone back onto the table. "I need to leave." He strided over to his bag and began stuffing its contents back in. "I'm so sorry. Could we reschedule? I should be finished around—" "Do they know about me?" he yelled. "Do they know I'm here?" His countenance changed. No longer was he the mild-mannered, if a little gruff, fisting coach. He was now a wild beast, cornered, eyes full of rage and distrust. "No, of course not," I pleaded. "Roll her up." He made for the doll lying spread-eagled on the plastic sheet. Try as I might to get a grip on the plastic sheet, it kept slipping out of my hands because of the lubricant. The side I was holding slipped out of my grip, and the doll fell to the floor. Panicking, I wiped my hands on my knees. 2 dark, glistening smears adorned the knees of my beige chino shorts. I pushed the doll back onto the sheet and got a grip of my side. Then we folded each side together like a bedsheet. "Put it down," he told me. He then rolled it over, wrapping it tightly. "Good," he said. "Is there a back door we can take to the garage?" He picked up the head and I the feet. Stinkfist lowered the doll into the boot of his car, an '89 Volvo whose paintwork must have seen better days. He squashed it in with his knee, then slammed the boot door shut. Then just as I was getting my wind back, from out of nowhere, a hand grabbed my throat. "We never met. This never happened." The look in his eyes told me he was telling the truth. The look in my eyes told him I believed him. I arrived home to my wife, still a little rattled by the incidents of the afternoon. "Were you around Proctor Street today?" she asked. "Proctor Street?" I replied. That was only a few blocks away from the open house showing. "No, why do you ask?" She changed the TV channel a few times, looking for something. "The report must be over," she said to herself. And then to me, "This afternoon, about an hour after you left, the police arrested someone on Proctor Street. Horrible stuff." "Really?" "Yeah. The police pulled somebody over for speeding. They heard a noise coming from the boot." She shook her head in disbelief. "Like a bumping noise," the report said. "Well, they opened the boot and found a young woman in there. She was wrapped in like a plastic tarpaulin. Her face was covered in cling film too." "That's ghastly," I said. "It's a good thing they found her." "That's not all," she began. "They said the poor girl looked to be a drug addict, had needle holes in her arms and all. They also recovered a black hacksaw and a bottle of bleach from the car." Yikes. After both concluding that there was some real sickos out there, we left the topic at that and didn't mention it again. We had dinner, fried egg with chips. I had gravy on mine. We were both too tired to make an effort to prepare something more substantial. "About the fisting thing," I said to my wife, while we were both reading in bed that night. She sighed. It was a sign of resignation. "Let's just leave that for a while, shall we?" I said, then kissed her good night. Having so much history myself with the paranormal, I don't freak out over creaks in the floor or the occasional door shutting on its own, and I believe most things can be explained. When we first moved into this house in Washington 3 years ago, we saw a few random orbs here and there, nothing that felt harmful. In fact, one orb even danced to the music alongside my granddaughter one day, and it felt like it might have been a child. The house sits on acres of field, surrounded by forest and a few farms. For some reason, the guest room, laundry and bathroom are always freezing cold, plus cool air comes from the guest bedroom closet. So I keep a blanket hanging up in the hall doorway to keep the cold isolated. I figured those rooms are just cold because they are added on and are built halfway over our well. I have my mother's ashes in my home, but at the same time I felt bad because when I was asked if I wanted my sister's ashes later, it scared me for some reason. I don't know why. She was a very loving person, but for many years I felt darkness around her, and so I just couldn't have her ashes with me. A year passed and thankfully that fear left me. I remembered her telling me one day before she died that she had a recurring dream of her death and she was stuck in the desert. It then dawned on me that her ashes were being cared for by my daughter, who lives in the desert. It was time to let her be here with Mom. After she'd arrived, her ashes were placed next to our mother's outside of my room, and like my mother, she was surrounded by some of her mementos. At first there wasn't a problem, but after time that's when the kids started seeing and experiencing things that made them feel uncomfortable. It didn't feel like my sister. This was something else. Strangely, absolutely no one in the family has felt her presence since she passed. I know my kids looked towards me for assurance. I guess they thought that like in other homes I could just make it all go away. But I think this stayed hidden from me in the beginning and preyed on those who showed fear, so it was targeting my grown kids. That being my son and his fiancée. I feel bad. I kept telling my son that there was nothing here, and that our house wasn't haunted because we cleansed it after my sister passed away. Cody, if you're reading this, I apologize for not wanting to believe you at the time. I was just trying to protect you and the kids from being scared. So these are a few things that have been happening in our home for the past few years. One late afternoon, I was at the store, so my son and fiancé were watching my 2 grandchildren for me. They were playing hide and seek, and they both took turns hiding from the kids in the guest room closet. They told me something wasn't right in there, and each of them experienced what they said felt like somebody or something taking up space with them in the closet, practically in their face. It has been a toy room in the beginning, but the kids wouldn't play in there. The only person who has slept in there with no problem is my ex on a visit. He was a non-believer until just the other day when we were sitting in there watching a show together and we observed his dog intently follow something move around the room. Then the bathroom door opened, and his dog watched whatever it was going into the bathroom, and the door shut behind it. At that point his dog dove under his blanket. My ex's eyes were as big as saucers, and he asked me if I'd seen what he saw. Laughing inside at the former non-believer, I said yes. No one else will sleep in there, not even me. 6 months ago, my son told me that he went into the kitchen to grab something to drink the night before, and he saw a dark shadow over his left shoulder in his reflection on the microwave. He turned around quickly to look behind him, and there was nothing there. But he still felt something close to him, and the hair on his arm and neck raised, so he looked in his reflection, this time in the window over the sink, and again it was back with its head even closer to his. Then the cabinet door shook back and forth, and opened all the way and shut. He said that he yelled, not caring if he woke anyone up, and ran upstairs to his room. I don't blame him. Many times he and his fiancée have seen big shadow masses in corners of various rooms, but never in my bedroom. Always waiting outside my door where my sister's ashes are, but never inside my room. There was a time not too long ago they both were sitting in my van, talking one night, and they said the form of a man came out from behind the tree, crossed the grass, and sat with his hands in his lap. on the front porch bench, then faded away. When they told me about the bathroom, oh my, that bathroom. His fiancée was taking a bath after everyone went to sleep, as to not disturb anyone. She was relaxing in our big old claw bathtub in the quiet of the night, and she heard us all sleeping, so she knew for a fact nobody was up. There was a tapping on the bathroom door. She answered, "Who is it?" But she got no response. Then the doorknob started to jiggle, then stopped. She said again, "Who is it? I'm in the bathtub." Still no response. She thought that whoever it was decided to go to the other bathroom, so she relaxed, and as she was laying there, something felt off, and she heard a noise at the door, and watched as the doorknob slowly unlocked itself. When she told me that, my blood went cold. This just didn't happen once. My son was sitting in there, and he heard tapping followed by the door unlocking on him too. The other day my son said that he had to go to the bathroom around 3 in the morning. He knew everyone was all asleep, because he heard us all snoring, so he didn't quite shut the door all the way, but it was closed. He heard heavy breathing, as if someone had their mouth at the crack of the door. Then he heard a quiet voice whisper, "I can hear you." That poor boy was scared to death. I for the first time experienced the doorknob unlocking on me 3 times in a row in my bathroom last night. That surprised me. It has not always been a bad experience here though. Since my mother passed, I feel her sometimes around me. We all do. Just last month I was talking to my son in the living room, and I saw a light. We don't live near a street, so it wasn't from a car. It was soft and illuminating as it floated from the front window curtain around to the wall behind my son. I got such a warm feeling and said, "Hello, Mama," and watched as it went behind the recliner where my son was sitting, and then up behind his head and disappeared. He didn't see this or know why I'd said that. Just then he shrugged his shoulders up and put his hand on the back of his head, saying that it felt like his hair was being stroked. That brought tears to us both. We all know when she is here, because it feels warm and loving, like her, and sometimes we smell her sweet perfume. My grandson, who is autistic, was too young to comprehend my mother's death. He sometimes talks to her, almost like he is answering what seems to be a question. He's only 6 and has the purest soul. I wish I could hear her voice speak to me again. And then you have things happen that at the time you don't understand, but when you find out, everything falls into place. This was one such time. In March we had a few aluminium balloons left over from my grandson's birthday, and they lasted a very long time. All of them fell to the floor, except one particular balloon. It kept following me midway in the air around the house. The air conditioner nor heater was on, and all the windows were shut. I went to my bedroom and it followed and stayed by my bed. I went into the laundry room and it followed there as well. This went on for a solid week, and after a while it started getting annoying, but we didn't think anything of it. We just swatted it away. One day my son and I were talking in the kitchen, and it came in from the living room where we'd just seen it laying on the floor moments before, and lowered itself to go under the door frame and stopped mid-height between us. He took it and pushed it back into the living room, and not even 4 minutes later it was back mid-height between us. This time he put it all the way into the laundry room, and it made its way back, lowering to come through this time 2 door frames, and stayed floating midway between us again. At that point it was too weird. We both looked at each other and said nah. So I took it and said, "Okay, if this is you, Mom, do it again." I put it back in the living room, and it stayed there floating. It didn't feel like her at that moment. It felt different, almost familiar, but not in a bad way. We went back to talking, and there it was again between us. Well, I didn't know this at the time. In fact, I just found out a few weeks ago that my dear friend passed away in March, and his family didn't have my number to tell me. One of the last things he told me was that when he dies he is going to come harass me just for fun and to let me know he is here and that he loves me. When I found out, I called out to my son, saying, "It was Tom!" After I told him the sad news, he said that it gave him a bit of peace. We all knew that this was something that he would do, and it blew our minds. I just wish I'd found out then, so I could have told him that I love him too. 3 nights ago, I saw a light low to the ground in the kitchen, and 5 minutes later, my granddaughter saw the same light formed like a feather fluttering in front of her. My son also told me that a light trailed up, over and across in his room. Another time he walked into my room and saw a light above my head. My neighbour is confident something happened on this land. I talked to him to see if he had been having any experiences or seeing anything unusual without making myself look crazy. He said that he doesn't go out after dark, but he has heard the screams in the forest and his pets acting strangely from time to time. As we were talking, his roommate came home and asked what we were talking about, and when I told him, he pointed to the young man I was talking to first and said, "You see, I'm not nuts." Apparently he has seen things as well and calls what he sees in his bedroom a demon boy because he doesn't know what it is. He even saged in his room. And if you think about it, that goes along with the orb that danced with my granddaughter when we first moved in. And no, it's not a demon. I think that perhaps a child is in some way connected to the property and it might roam. We have seen so many beautiful things here that it outweighs the bad. Someday after I'm gone, I hope to be a part of that. I want to be the whisper of encouragement in my loved one's ear and a gentle stroke upon their face. I want them to always know that they don't have to be afraid and that they are and always will be loved from now until forever. As for what is here in this house, I think since I have been more aware of the darkness, it shows itself less. I do enjoy feeling my loved ones around though, and my kids do too. Someday we will move from this place, and hopefully only our loved ones will follow. The year was 1968, and my family was living in Hollywood, California. This was a time when nobody locked their doors at night, and your children could play safely outside until the streetlights came on. This occurred a few weeks before my 5th birthday, and I was very small for my age, the youngest of 6. It was a normal day. Kids were playing outside, and some of my siblings were riding their bikes and playing in the courtyard. Now I wanted to ride on the back of my brother's bike, but he was playing with my sister Melanie. So I remember hopping up and down on the sidewalk, bugging my older siblings to give me a ride. My sister Rachel gave in, because I think she was tired of hearing me beg. But our mother had told us to never ride our bikes without wearing shoes. I think sometimes because Rachel was so hard-headed, she thought that those rules never applied to her. So she picked me up and put me on the back of her bike in the banana seat and told me to hold on to the sissy bar. The moment I realized she didn't have pegs for my feet, I got scared. No, I'm scared, I changed my mind, I told her over and over. But at that point she wasn't going to stop and told me that it would be fine. Just hold your feet out wide, she told me. Now Rachel had a tendency to sway every time she pumped the pedal, and my little legs were teetering back and forth, until whoosh, my foot went into the bicycle spoke, and off came my toe. There was blood everywhere, and I immediately started screaming. She grabbed me up and ran with my blood streaming right past my other siblings and right into the apartment. Oh, the look on my mother's and eldest sister's face. They were hysterical. So my sister Charity wrapped my foot with a towel and ran carrying me outside, where we all piled into the station wagon, leaving my brother and Melanie at home. The ride to the hospital was scary, as Mum was screaming and honking the horn at other drivers, and my eldest sister was talking a mile a minute whilst holding my foot above my head. Charity was stroking and wiping my tears away, cupping my face so I didn't see how bad it really was. I think I was in shock, because it really didn't hurt that much, until it started to throb, that is. We must have been a sight. A crazy woman trying to get help, and her kids all covered in blood with my foot in the air. Needless to say that they took us in right away. Going through the corridors, I remember the smell of rubbing alcohol, and they rushed me into a room with a metal table, and right away I was frightened. They unwrapped the towel from my foot, and for the first time I saw the mangled mess that was once my toe, blackened by the grease from the chain on the bike. Mama kept assuring me that everything was going to be okay, but the look on her face told me differently. You see, I'd lost too much blood. The doctor asked if she had the rest of my toe, so she called home and asked my brother and sister to go find it. Now this is the funny part. My brother and my sister Melanie walked down the street to where this all happened. They were looking up and down the sidewalk and street for my severed toe, when an old lady, who was sitting on her porch, asked them what they were doing. My brother told her that he was looking for his little sister's toe so the doctors could sew it back on. The old lady told him that she'd seen the toe, put it in a baggie and threw it in the big dumpster, and if he wanted it he would have to climb in and dig it out. So that's what he did. After he'd found it, he jumped out, and my sister Melanie, who was standing there the whole time with her eyes bigger than saucers, went with him to the neighbour's apartment to ask his friend's mum for a ride to the hospital. The second she opened the door, she stepped back whilst holding her nose, because my brother smelled like trash. She put a towel on the seat and gave them a ride. In the meantime, I was still in the room where they were using long needles to numb my foot, and I was crying my little eyes out. At one point, my mother had her eyes closed, so I asked her what she was doing. As my voice skipped a breath, she told me to be calm. "Shh," she said. "See the white light around you and envision God's white healing light all around you and be calm." I closed my eyes and tried my best, but the pain was too great. I gripped the sheet and tried to be brave, but it wasn't working. My heart was going a mile a minute, and with all that commotion in the room, I couldn't calm down. By now the other half of my toe had showed up, and they started preparing me for surgery. I pleaded with my mother to stay with me, but of course the doctors said no, so I started freaking out. My mother felt helpless, so she held me one last time, and whilst I was in her arms I saw a bright light over her shoulder. It was so bright that I had to squint my eyes and try to move her aside to see what it was. A man with long black hair and caramel-coloured skin, wearing a long orange robe and a glow from his face, was standing there smiling at me. Standing next to him was what looked like a beautiful male angel that was so bright that his light filled the room. I felt warmth come all over my body, and a sense of peace calmed my heart. I looked at my mother and told her that she could leave and not worry. She looked confused, so I told her that my guardian angel was standing right there with another one of my angels. "Don't you see them?" I asked my mother and Charity, but they didn't see anything. She put my hand on her cheek and I told her not to cry, because I wasn't scared anymore. They wheeled me into the operating room and gave me something that put me to sleep, telling me that I would wake up soon. I remember seeing the doctors and nurses all working on me, with a big round light blocking out their faces, and I was listening to them talk. My body felt light and I felt myself floating up over their heads. I saw my little body laying there, and looking over to the other side of the room, I noticed that the man in the orange robe extended his hand, and the angels smiled, giving off the most calming vibration. I heard the doctor talking to the nurse, and he was telling her that his daughter was about the same age as I was, and that he was very concerned because she's very sick and has an important operation that she has to have soon. I looked up at the angel's face, and she nodded her head and smiled. It felt like only moments had passed when I was being pulled back into my body. I woke up seeing my mother's beautiful face smiling and her eyes full of tears. They told my mother that I would have to have quite a few more operations before I could walk, and that I might have a limp. They also said I was lucky it wasn't my whole foot, being as small as I was. Well, there were no regular rooms available at the time, so they had to put me in the pediatric burn ward. The room smelled weird, and it had to be kept cold. There were 4 other girls in there, some laying in contraptions to hold them still. The only bed they had for me was a big metal crib with bars that went all the way up like a cage. I didn't know I was going to be staying there all night. I thought that when my mother said that I would be only there for a little bit, I would be going home soon. They asked my elder sister if I could feed myself, and of course I could, so she said yes. Then the nurse marked something down. After my family left for the night, I don't think because of all the commotion in the room with the other patients that it truly set in that I was all alone. There was a girl that stood too close to the floor heater, so it set her nightgown on fire. One was playing with matches, and one girl reached over the stove and caught her sleeve on fire. Well, the girl with the nightgown was laying in a contraption that held her in place, and she was watching TV through a mirror because her chin was stuck to her chest. This was all very traumatic for me. I didn't understand what was going on. It was time for bed, and all the visitors were gone, so the nurses came in and put sandbags between some of the girls' legs so their legs didn't touch each other in their sleep. And then the nurses put a sheet on them. They cried in pain being moved, so when the nurse came to me and asked if I wanted a blanket, I thought she was going to do the same thing to me, and I had already had a stabilizer on my foot. So being scared, I said no. The lights were dim and the TV was off. A few faint moans were made from the other girls throughout the night, and I was missing my mum. The night was long and I was so cold that I started to shiver and quietly cried myself, soaking my pillow with tears, when I felt that the same warmth I had felt before reached through the bars towards the light, and someone held my hand. I didn't feel like crying anymore, and my eyes became very heavy and I fell asleep. The next morning the nurses woke us up bright and early, and the hospital was bustling with different noises. An orderly came in and put my food on a tray. She said that it says here that you can feed yourself, and then she left. Well, there was a stabilizer on my foot, and there were bars on my bed, so I couldn't feed myself if I wanted to. I laid there and it felt like forever since I'd seen my family, and I was hungry. I almost started to cry when I heard a voice. "Hey you, little girl, over here." I tried to prop myself to see who was calling me, but I didn't see anyone. "I saw you last night," the voice said. "Who was that by your bed?" The girl across from me was looking through her mirror and moved her foot, telling me, "I'm right here." She asked me again, so I told her that it was my angel. She said that she wished she had an angel, so I told her that she does. She just can't see her. I think that made her feel better, but that's what I believe to be true. My family came and went, leaving me with my own blanket, and the next day I was able to go home. On the way out, I insisted on seeing the doctor who was sewing my toe. I said that I had something very important to tell him right away. The nurse thought that was cute, I guess, so she called him on the intercom, and shortly he arrived to meet us all in the hall. He asked me what he could do for me, so I motioned him down to the wheelchair with my finger and said that I needed to tell him something in his ear. So he bent down to my face and I whispered, "Thank you." Then I told him that his daughter will be just fine, I know it. Then I said that she won't be sick anymore, so don't worry. Then I kissed him on his cheek. He stood up and stuttered, holding his mouth. Then he hugged my mum for a long time. My mother didn't know what to think. So on the way home I told her all about my new friends in the burn ward and all the things that happened to me there. My mother told me as I got older that it never surprised her when I was little, because I was always saying things or unexplained things would happen around me. I miss my mother. In my work as a child protection officer, I sometimes come across some unsettling things. This is all part of the job, I'm assured, but some things are worse than others, if you can imagine. One day on a visit to a home that we knew, one that had been in our files for a long time, I came across this note. It was scrawled in green crayon. I have it typed below. Mr. Spike visits Daddy every day to bring him candy, sometimes even 2 times a day. It's my job to get him all full up with the candy before Daddy meets him. Mr. Spike sure is a funny-looking fella. He's all thin and clear and made of plastic, with a long silver nose, which he uses to kiss Daddy with. He looks like that pinpricker thing what the doctor gives you when you're young so you don't get sick. Sometimes when I push on him real hard, he squirts his guts out of his nose. But Daddy gets awful angry if I do that before he meets him. "Don't you go shortchanging Daddy, little one." I didn't hear Daddy's voice no more after he told me that. He done took his candy what I gave him, then went to sleep in his big old chair like he always does. I think shortchanging means not skimping on how much candy I give Mr. Spike. Last time I didn't give him as much as he liked, and he gave me a terrible bad beating. I couldn't sit down for a week. My friends at school thought it was very funny. So tonight I made sure to give Mr. Spike more than what's normal. I use the spoon Daddy gives me to cook up his candy mostly, but tonight I thought it was a good idea to use that big spoon in the second drawer, the one that Mama used to use to mix up cakes before she went away. Daddy's candy filled it up really nice. He sure ain't gonna hit me around tonight. I could hear a slapping noise. The mosquitoes were on Daddy's arm again. Them little bloodsuckers are always on Daddy's arm after I take Mr. Spike over to meet him. But he makes it better soon. They fly away and don't bite his arm no more after he takes the candy from Mr. Spike. Anyway, tonight after Mr. Spike's visit, Daddy didn't wake up. I had me a bad dream about monsters and tried to wake Daddy up to read me a happy story, but he's still sleeping. Even a cup of cold water didn't wake him up. I slapped him like Mama used to, but he didn't move. There was no smelly air coming out of his nose either, and his belly wasn't going in and out anymore. Yep, I think Daddy's gone to Jesus' house now. That ain't good, 'cause Mama gonna come down here soon and see Daddy here sleeping again. I gotta hide Daddy, and I gotta take Mr. Spike away too, 'cause he's still got his long pointy nose stuck in Daddy's arm. I tried pulling Daddy off the chair and rolling him up somewhere like under the table, but he loves eating those hamburgers too much, and he was too heavy to move. I had to make him small so I could carry him off somewhere. This one time we had a big old tree in our backyard that Mama wanted to use for firewood. She don't like paying money for firewood. So to get it inside the house we had to cut it up into teensy little pieces. It sure was hard, all that cutting and sawing, but we had a terrible easy time moving it. I thought maybe I could pretend Daddy is like the trees and make him into small bits, then hide him. It would be just like cutting up a Christmas ham or that big turkey bird we had at the church last Thanksgiving. The knife goes in all right, just hard to take it out. Some of Daddy's soft parts cut up real nice, and lots of strawberry jam came out and makes my hands real sticky. Daddy's neck looked like a soda can that'd been shook up when I poked at it with the cutter. There was strawberry jam flying all over the place and making the walls all red and black. Mama ain't gonna like this one bit. Daddy's spitting strawberry jam and making my eyes sting so hard to keep writing. Plus it tastes awfully bad. I took the big bits to the pig shack out back and put the small bits in the trash muncher in the kitchen sink. Them porkers eat any old thing, so they started to eat Daddy up real good. Some were even fighting over the tasty pieces of Daddy's belly. They've always been greedy. I best hide Mr. Spike in the pig shack too. If someone is reading this and you find Mr. Spike, tell this from me. Sorry, Mr. Spike. Don't feel bad. Daddy really likes you. Sometimes you make him mad, but I know he ain't really mad at you. It's okay. He don't get angry no more, 'cause now he's dead. When I finished reading it, I made my way out to the pig pen. I work at a Severance psychiatric hospital. I'm a psychiatrist, and I had to meet a patient. We met at the hospital for 2 weeks, where we talked a lot of the time. He told me his trauma, and I felt pity for him. But until yesterday, we had a good relationship. Since then, he has persistently asked me uncomfortable questions. I didn't answer them. I pushed his shoulder and I firmly ordered him to sit down. On his face, he had a look of disgust. "How dare you order me about?" he said, seeming to despise me. He returned to the desk, sat down, and dusted off his shoulder that I had pushed. He told himself that he was hopeless. Perhaps he didn't think that I would hear him. I approached him with open eyes, and he looked perplexed. He was looking at me, and I could see that his right hand was shuffling around under the desk. He must have been looking for a weapon to attack me with. So I hit his right hand hard with my fist, and he screamed loudly. We got into a fight, and after 10 minutes, I'd been able to pin him down. If I'd let my guard down for even a moment, I could have been overpowered by him. I picked up the syringe on the table, but I didn't know what was in it. I just picked one of the several shots on the desk and injected it next to his neck. I hoped it would calm him down. He blinked slowly, and I felt his hand, that was holding onto my face, was losing strength. I punched him in the face as hard as I could, hit him again with a nearby book, and he finally fell down and was knocked out cold. I was heavily perspiring after the fight and decided he needed to be now tied to the bed. I felt so sad doing it, as what doctor wants to have to tie up his patient? But there were no other options. I was afraid of him getting up and carrying on the attack, so I injected him again in the neck. His body was as cold as ice, and I looked up at his face, worried that he might be dead. Fortunately, though, he was breathing. I looked at the clock and it was 8 p.m. The hospital was getting ready to close. I hung a sign on my door saying, "On vacation," as I didn't want anyone to disturb me. I slept next to him that night as to keep a close eye on him, when I was suddenly awoken by a scream within the room. I looked at the clock and the time was already 1 a.m. The patient had also come to, then saw me and screamed like crazy again. He tried to run away, but his arms and legs were tied to both beds. He started to shed tears after realizing the situation he was in, and his voice trembled like a child's as he called my name and asked me to let him go. I don't know why he was afraid, and I was heartbroken after seeing him like that. I offered him a sedative, but he asked me not to administer it. He begged me, in fact. I showed him a warm smile and looked on the desk. There were many syringes there, but I didn't know which one to give him. So I finally chose one and gave it to him. At first he had some convulsions. His body was stiff and only his eyes moved. The time was now 3 a.m. I heard a cough in the room. I looked around and saw it was my patient. He was coughing, and it looked like he was trying to say something. I approached him slowly. "If you let me go now, I won't call the police," he said in a small, shivering voice. I had done my best for him, but my sacrifices and efforts were crushed by the words police and report. It made me so angry. He kept trying to persuade me, and as time went on, he opened up to me. He told me that deep down that I was a good man and that I was getting better. I listened intently until he went on to say, "You're not a doctor. Wake up." I got up and began to approach him, and as I did, I asked him, "Right hand or left hand?" I brought a chair to the side of the bed, and sitting down, I stroked his hand. As soon as I did this, his bed began to shake tremendously. He was begging me now, as I said firmly, "If you don't tell me, I'll choose myself." I started to count down, giving him a limited time to give me an answer. He said nothing until I reached 0. I got up from my seat and walked around the bed to where he was tied up. He was watching me intently. His head was facing forwards. I could feel his eyes following when I grabbed the joint of his left index finger. There was a moment of silence as I took a deep breath and closed my eyes. I was now alone in the middle of a road. Whiteness all around. I found a pretty flower garden though, so I gently plucked the 3 prettiest flowers to take them home. I then suddenly heard a branch break when I picked the flowers, and as I tried to pick the flowers up and take them, they folded up and couldn't be picked. Blood then flowed from them and I became very confused. I opened my eyes and had come back. I looked at him and saw only the whites of his eyes. He was now drooling, so I wiped his mouth with a tissue that was already next to him. He began to laugh and cry like a madman, pointing his middle finger at me and telling me to go to hell. I went back to my desk and thought for a moment. Opening the desk drawer, I found some scissors and staples. I looked at him and he smiled at me. After about 10 minutes, I asked him a question, but he didn't answer. I tried to get a conversation from him, but there was nothing. I lost interest in the role of being a doctor, so I took off my dirty doctor's clothes and covered his still, lifeless body with them. I took some clothes that were hanging up and put them on. They didn't fit and were totally inappropriate for the time of year. Then when I opened the door to my office, a ray of light came into the dark room. It was now 7 a.m, and several doctors and nurses were busily moving around and doing their work. I walked into the hallway and into a nurse holding various papers. She asked me who I was. I looked at her, then quickly left the place without saying a word. She entered the room I had just been in. Then I heard the sound of a gasp and documents falling to the floor.